Good morning. You should be happy that I didn't get up on stage dancing to the music. All right, good morning. Hi, I'm Derick. This slide has now already been done. If you have questions about it, come find me later. I like maps, beer, and whiskey. It's very unrelated, but I thought I'd throw it out there. So yeah, I'd like to dive straight in. So this is a talk that I give many times. However, every time it is different because we added new things to PHP, right? So this is the first one that is titled What's New in PHP 8.4, because almost all of the things have now been settled that's going to make it into the language, hopefully coming out at the end of November. Now, I don't have the time to talk about all the features in here, but there are a few talks at the conference that dive into some of these features. So where I remember, I will try to point you to these talks if you're interested in them. So, like I said, there will be code on screen. Some of the code, as you can see, will not fit on the slide. It has fallen off the bottom, but that's only the bits that are not interesting whatsoever. So probably one of the bigger new features in PHP 8.4, combined with the one I'll be showing in a moment, is something called asymmetric visibility. Now, this is some code that I've written a long time ago, so that's kind of, well, it's not the most optimal, let me put it that way, for a little thing that I throw around to download GPX trails. And I have this private property that my constructor is going to parse the file and stick it in there. But of course, I don't want classes that, or code that reads this, to be able to modify this. So the traditional way of doing this is, well, you have this private property, and then you have a method to get these things out of this private property, right? So that you can, everybody can still, or every bit of code can still read this. That's kind of annoying to have to do. So PHP 8.4, we have this new syntax here, which is public and then private sets. So basically, you can give two different visibilities to properties now. The standard one, public, is for public read, and then we have a private set, meaning that only code from this class can write to it, like you'd have normally with a private function, but publicly you can also read, which is kind of a nice way of doing it. There's actually a shorter version of this as well, which you can just leave out the public, because that's implied if you just do private set. And that, of course, then means that you can throw all your getter code away, because you don't need this anymore. You can just access the property. So that's asymmetric visibility. There's a few other things in here that are sort of important to know. Like most of the new features in PHP, all this kind of fancy typing, hooks kind of thing, only ever works on type properties. That's an optimization inside a PHP engine. If you set a set visibility, so public, private set, the set visibility needs to be the same or lower. So you can't have private read and public set. Makes no sense if you think about it, so you can't do that. If you use arrays in there, with like the square bracket, which is the append operator, then this follows the set visibility, because you need to maintain a reference first. Inherited properties basically works exactly how you'd expect it to do. But there's also one specific thing, is like private set also implies it's final. For many complicated reasons, if you want to read up on those, I can point you to the RFC about this, because it explains this in great detail why this is the case. And because this also sort of interacts read-only in sort of way, so read-only properties are now going to be seen the same as a protected set, but still with having the wide runs semantics. Now, exactly why this is too long to explain in this early morning presentation. Now, a similar thing is that PHP 8.4 adds something more to properties, is called property hooks. It comes in many different variants. But basically what it allows you to do is to define a property, in this case, public string full name, and then you can define which operations need to happen when you write to the property by using the set hook, or what happens if you read from the property. So what I've done here is that my get operation is basically returns a concatenation of the first name, a space, and a surname, or the last name. I know that is not how names work, but it's the example here. Similarly, if you do a set here, what it will actually do is it will take your string, exploded by the space, and then assign the first bit to this first and the second one to this last. So you can actually write to two different properties from just writing to a single one. Now, this is a property that doesn't have an actual property associated with it. It is only a virtual property because there's nowhere in the set and get does it actually refer to an actual property with the same name as full name. So these properties are virtual properties and they don't really exist very much. Now, this is a contrived example from the RFC, but when I was upgrading some of my code to make it work with PHP 8.4 with the latest release candidates, I actually ran into a few cases where this was actually quite useful. Again, this is code that is very old. It's been written for PHP 5.2, but it still works with 8.4 after a few modifications in the last, let's say, 16 years or so, whatever it was. So I have this class here, and back then in PHP 5.3 land, there was no such thing as type properties, right? It just didn't exist. So we still, in our API, we wanted to make sure that if you set a property, then we wanted to enforce the type. So what we had done is we had not defined the properties, but basically we're storing all the properties in this protected array properties. You couldn't type it as an array either yet. And then what we would define as set hook, look at what the name is, and then if it's not a Boolean in this case, then we would throw an exception. Now, of course, you know how to fix this already, right? Because in PHP 7.4, we got the type properties. So that would have fixed that case. I didn't update it, but I would have fixed it. However, we also had some other versions where we didn't only want to check for the type, but also for the values that are allowed for the type. And you can't do that with just setting your property to be only an integer value, because that doesn't enforce that the number needs to be 0 or higher. So now with PHP 8.4, you can do that. You can define your property as a public int list limit, and then on the set operation, what we do is the value is smaller than 0, then we throw the value error. So with a lot less code, you can now do that. Now, I just realized, although I updated the slide, I didn't put the code back in again. This set operation doesn't actually do anything because I don't assign this list limit to the value that's coming in. So that should be after the if statement here. So there's also one difference between this property than the virtual one with the first name and last name, because this property actually has data associated with it directly. And therefore, it is an actual property with extra semantics because we defined this set hook here. So these are kind of the things that we have with new property hooks. Now, I showed you the syntax with just a single statement. You can also have multiple statements and stuff like that in each set block. At the moment, there's only set and get. If you want to do something with references, there's a specific get with an ampersand sign to do something with that as well. I don't think you should be looking at using that, but it is there if you need it. And yeah, I think this is actually a very nice feature to add on top of the already more typey PHP language. Now, this is something that's always annoyed me a lot. If you have to do a new object and then you need to call a method, you had to put it in between parentheses. Luckily in PHP 8.4, you no longer need to do that. So you can just not type them and it works. Is this important? I don't know. But it does work with all the other places where you expect this to happen. So you can use it to access class constant or static properties and methods, call the properties, call the methods. With one condition, you need to have these parentheses. Because normally if you do new my class, you don't have to have the parentheses at the end. But to make sure of this syntax where you immediately access something, you need to have the parentheses. The reason for that is mostly because otherwise you get lots of conflicts when you look at the code, because what would new my class : constant mean? Would that mean new my class or new the name of or the value of the constant on my class, right? To use that as an object name. So fix that ambiguity in reading the language by PHP's parser, the parentheses need to be there. And then you can get funny things like parentheses, parentheses. Is that code you should be writing? Probably not, but you can. For a long, long time, PHP has had an HTML and XML parser, backed by libxml. So libxml is something that most of you will have used, and it implements HTML4 parsing. Now, how many of you are still using HTML4 on your websites? Probably not so many. Most of the time, it's now all HTML5. But the parser that PHP had for parsing HTML was the HTML4 parser. And that, of course, because these are not always the same, it also seems that sometimes if something in the HTML is wrong, it would resolve it in different ways. You couldn't actually officially parse HTML5, and that in some certain circumstances that could introduce potential security issues. The RFC again explains why. So what we have done for PHP 8.4 is that we replaced the HTML parser with a new one that is an HTML5 parser. But we didn't really want to break people's code, right? Because breaking people's code is not a useful thing to do. So what happened is that we created a new class, or a few new classes, in the new namespace called DOM, Document Object Model. So we have a new XML document class in there that basically wraps the old, the old XML parser routines. And then we have a new HTML document class which also does that, but it implements this new HTML5 parser. But it's all with the same interfaces. And then the DOM document class has been redefined as just extending the new DOM/document one. So that basically means that although we use a new functionality, you don't have to change your code. But if you want to use the HTML5 parser, then you need to opt into this. So that was the originality, got implemented, all good news. And then a little bit further on, we also found out that the XML parser that PHP implements doesn't actually follow the XML standard very well in some cases. But of course, changing how the old XML document worked means that it could break somebody's code that might rely on this old functionality. But because we now have this wrapping class, we can now choose, or we have chosen to use this new wrapped class to also address basically all the bugs in the original XML parser to bring that up to spec as well. That wasn't the original intention, but it ended up happening as well. So I think that's good news because we get better things, and I like better things. So there's something new in PHP 8.4. It's called lazy objects. And every presentation needs to have cat pictures. This is a very complex subject. So I'm not going to have the time to talk about it here, but there's a talk later. I think it's tomorrow at 12:25, if I remember correctly, that has a whole presentation about the new lazy objects in PHP. And this is how I felt this morning as well, as a lazy cat. All right, moving on. PHP 8.0 was basically PHP 7.5, but renamed to PHP 8.0 because we got this just-in-time compiler. It's a way of being able to speed up PHP to run directly on CPU code or machine code. So this would compile PHP code to x86 or the 64-bit variant machine code, and then run it directly on the CPU for the cases where that makes sense. That is really useful for specific functions that you have written that implement some logic. It makes not a lot of sense if it calls a lot of other functions, because every time you call a function, you need to come out of JIT, or PHP needs to come out of JIT mode and go back into it again. And that means function calls as well. So it gave a few % performance boost in PHP 8.0. But it was sort of an experimental thing, and although it was working fine for x86 CPUs, if you wanted to support ARM, you basically had to rewrite the whole thing. And more and more people started using ARM, so that's not so good, right? So in 8.4, we actually have a new just-in-time compiler in PHP. You would not notice this when using it. but it is done in a much better way. It is much easier to read. There's actual documentation so that more people can at least try to understand how this works. And because there's this intermediate version of it, it also makes it a lot easier to then target for other CPUs without having to do the whole thing as well. So that's good news. You're not going to notice that whatsoever, except that more things might be slightly faster. We also changed the default settings. Like if you see 8.0, by default, the JIT was on and the buffer size was set to 0. A buffer size of 0 basically meant that the JIT was off. But in PHP 8.4, we went through slightly more useful settings. Default, like it is disabled by default, and then you set the buffer size separately from that. It just makes more sense as defaults. Now, the reason why the JIT engine isn't always necessarily enabled, because it does require you to look at the buffer size, and sometimes if your stuff doesn't fit in there, it won't work very well. And also, we can't always make assumptions that you run on an x86 CPU, for example. I have never turned this on anywhere, not even in production, because I never felt the need for it, to give a few more percentage. And you also need to realize that when you turn on JIT mode, in the engine, it's a whole different path being followed for lots of implementations of operations and things like that. And if that isn't used as much as normal PHP, then it's possible that there will be different bugs in PHP if you have JIT enabled than if you don't have it enabled. So there's kind of an extra vector for potential issues in the engine. And I, therefore, didn't really bother ever turning it on. But maybe I should have. All right, let's look at a few more smaller features in PHP 8.4. We are going to get a deprecated attribute. It's an attribute you can set on basically all the things that call stuff, or where you can currently, at least in PHP's engine, can have deprecated things. So you can have a deprecated function. In this case, the function test3 is deprecated. And in the attribute, you can set a message. In this case, use test instead. And then there's also this extra argument called since, which gives you a free text form of providing some extra information when this function or other thing was deprecated. If you use reflection, you can actually access this information, which is then useful in some other tooling around to figure out, well, during development at least, why these things were deprecated. So we have this on functions. We also have this on class properties, on methods. So in this case, if you try to call class test2, you get an error, and then the thing fell off the screen, and you get the same thing for constants. It is basically a slightly more formalized way of marking methods and constants as deprecated, instead of having to use a PHP doc tag with the @deprecated, because PHP itself wouldn't do anything with this, whereas with the deprecated attribute, PHP would do something with that. It is also possible that inside the engine for internal functions, we can use those same attributes, so that also the terminology and the error messages all look the same as well. So just a little benefit there as well. I haven't updated my code to use any of this yet, but I probably will at some point soon. Oh yeah, it also works for enums. I had forgotten about that. If you're interested in enumerations, there's a talk about that later in this conference as well. And I believe that it's, no, I don't want to guess that because I'm going to get it wrong. Right, I mentioned that. Maybe slightly, you might notice that I started with the big new fun things and it's getting less and less interesting. I should have done that the other way around really, right? Start with the little things and end with the big things. If you ever use PDO, you know that you instantiate PDO objects by doing new PDO and not depending on any sort of database you use. Which is kind of annoying because some of the PDO drivers for, say, Firebird or ODBC, they sometimes have additional methods. Like as an example, MySQL has this get warnings count method, which PostgreSQL doesn't have. but they were still defined on the PDO object, which is kind of weird because it wouldn't work. So in PHP 8.4 now, all the PDO drivers have their own subclass, which means we then potentially could define these database-specific methods on. I don't believe that is work that has happened yet, but I think that's something we'll probably see for PHP 9 whenever that comes. In order to make use of this, you can't do new PDO, because if you do new PDO, getting a subclass of PDO is a bit weird, technically not possible to do correctly. So in order to make use of this functionality, instead of using new PDO, you have to do PDO connect, give it your DSN, and then it will automatically return a PDO instance of the right subclass, in this case, PDO SQLite. I think this is kind of neat. I haven't made use of it yet myself either. Now we get to maths. Who doesn't want maths at 10:20 in the morning? And this is rounding modes. Now, rounding modes in PHP, you probably have heard of ceil and floor, right? And round. Either round down to, or chop off the fractional part, or round up to the next integer, or round on depending whatever you want to do. Did you know there are actually many more different ways how you can do rounding? In fact, there's 8 of them. Again, I will make this a bit smaller. So there are many different ways of how you can do rounding. And depending on which mode it is, you get different outputs. Now, I don't want to go through all of the maths, but we now have, instead of just having ceil and floor, the round method itself takes the value, the number of decimals, and now this rounding mode as a enumeration. So you have halfway away from 0, halfway towards 0, half even. These all mean slightly more complicated things. Hopefully, these have been documented very well, but I haven't checked that yet. But yeah, it is basically a more formal way of describing, and sometimes also better ways by using a real name for the specific rounding modes to do something useful with. You can go over the table and figure out whether it's correct or not at some other point when you have a look at the slides, which I have uploaded somewhere. Other things, like hopefully most of you hash passwords with bcrypt, right? So then bcrypt is an algorithm that has a cost factor. And a cost factor basically says, like, how often do I run this algorithm? And it is not every increase of the number doesn't mean doing it once more, but doing it twice as many times. So 9 and 10 is not 1 step, but it is 2 steps, really, or 2 times the cost. Now, password hash was added in PHP 5.5 11 years ago when our CPUs weren't that fast. So the current the cost for that was picked at 10. Why 10? I can't tell you, but that's what it was. But we are now 11 years further, and password hashing is now a lot faster because we have faster computers. And it meant that sort of 10 was now going to be too easy to brute force. So we decided, well, we need to increase this. And we need to increase this to make sure that for modern CPUs, this is also still good enough. And an interesting thing, good enough in this case actually means make it slower. Because if you think about it, you want to make it as hard as possible for people to brute force your hashes, right? So the longer it takes is better. Of course, in a web application, you don't want to wait seconds for your passwords to get hashed, so you need to pick a reasonable value here. So we did some guesstimations to figure out what would be the best optimal cost factor. And we ended up picking 12, which means that a password now hashes in about 1/3 of a second, which is just about enough for your web applications, right? If you type your password 1/3 of a second, people probably don't notice that after entering information. Now, this is the default setting. You can, anytime you do password hashing, you can also lower this number or make it even higher if you find a need for that. I think it's a wise thing to do now. Whether we should have picked 11 or 12 for it, I don't know, but we settled on 12. Now, you see my emoji in the top of the screen. If I str split this, anybody wants to guess what comes out of this? Shout out. You get a whole bunch of this, right? Because an emoji like this, if you well, in this case, how many bytes is it? Let's say 12. But that is not how you split up things, right? How would you normally do a split of something like a Unicode string or a UTF-8 string? What would you do for that in PHP? What you would do is you'd use MB string, right? So if you do this, how many characters do you get out now? Anyone's guess? It's 4. And that looks a little bit odd if you're not familiar with what's happening here, because most of the emojis that you see are basically a combination of other things. So this is, I don't actually know what this emoji is, but it is a shouty person, something, and then the male variant of it here. And the way how this character gets composed is you have the base emoji, you have a non-joining with character, whatever that may mean, then the modification to apply the male hints to it, and then you have another character to do that. Now, this is still not something you want, right? If you want to loop over characters, you don't want to split up your emoji in different things and store that differently. So PHP 8.4 introduces a new feature or function called grapheme string split, which will then know about these combined characters and do the right thing for it. Interestingly, if you have combined characters like the A or flags, flags are also done in a similar way. They're also combined characters. And now, if you do grapheme string splits, and of course it falls off the screen again, you can also see that in this case, the flag is also now considered as one character. If you use MB string split, then that would be, let's see, 4 characters again. It would be the letters FR, and then some other things around it to make it a flag and kind of things. I think this is a good way of doing this if you have to handle this. Now, grapheme string split actually comes from the Intel extension, which also has iterators over characters. And these iterators, if you created a grapheme iterator, would also already do that. Grapheme string split is just an addition to fit in with the normal string split and the MB string split to sort of have the same APIs that many of you are already using. Now, lots of my code has something like this. And as far as I remember correctly, you might yell at me later if I'm incorrect here, this is also the standard Symfony coding standard for defining an object as nullable as well. The way how this got introduced before PHP had nullable types is by using equals null at the end, and by doing that as a default, your type for the class, in my case RSC options, would also be a nullable class. Now in PHP 8.4, that's no longer the case. And it will now give you a deprecation warning saying implicitly marking options as nullable is deprecated, and then it tells you to use the explicit nullable type. So you have to change all your code from this to this, having the question mark in front of it to make it nullable, or preferably, now of course, falls off the screen, to use this or null. When I went to test most of the code I'd written a long time ago with PHP 8.4, I had to fix this several hundred times. Hopefully tools like Rector will be able to help you do this automatically, and I'm sure there's other tools for that as well. Now, so far I've been talking a little bit about the functionality in PHP 8.4, but we also have changed a few other things. Like lots of the things that the PHP development team comes up with gets hidden away in RFCs. RFCs are a way of proposing new features, or also sometimes proposing new policies, like when do we do releases, how often we do them, and so on and so on. But all of that stuff was in a big mess, far away from each other. There was no real consolidated documentation. Like if we had a modification to the rule, it was written as the modification, a patch really, without having the final document somewhere available. And that makes it sometimes really hard to actually figure out what our internal rules are. So we started up a new GitHub repository, PHP/policies, where the intention is that we put in all these consolidated documentation to make it easier for us to figure out what all the rules are, and also for everybody else to try to figure out what all these rules are. So we have created it, we moved all the related information in there, but what we haven't done yet is actually rewriting it in such a way that it reads as a proper document. It's still a bunch of text, but then some modifications at the end. That's my fault, I simply haven't had the time for that. Now, while doing that, we also decided to come up with some new policies for PHP as well. So PHP's release cycle's always been like this. You get 2 years of proper bug fix support and then a year of security support where we would only fix bugs in PHP. In a release cycle, that was quite long. We had 3 alphas, 3 beta releases, 3 release candidates, and each of these is 2 weeks. So that makes 24 weeks of time where basically we couldn't really add new things to PHP. And 24 is about, well, say a third of the year, right? So it's not so good. We had some other rules for that as well, and it also meant that the support ends exactly 3 years after the initial release. So if PHP 8.1 came out in November, say 21st, then it came out of support November 2024. And that always shifted a little bit. So what we decided to do is actually to change is that we now have 2 years of bug fix support with 2 years of security fixes, which isn't actually so much of a difference for us because the security support isn't that much work to do. We also shortened the release cycle from 12 weeks to 10 weeks. So that's, sorry, from 12 releases to 10 releases, and that shortens the release cycle by about a month, which is kind of nice to have. And we also clarified a few rules, like we're not introducing new minor features in beta releases, and we can't add these things during release candidates. And that also means that now the support ends at the end of the 4th year, not 4 years after the initial release. In the diagram, it looks like this. So if we have PHP 8.1 here, got released December 2nd, 2001, that then went into security mode 2 years later, but we're now extending that so that it doesn't end at December 2nd, 2025, but instead match it up with the end of the year, which makes a little bit more sense. It also makes these graphs easier to make, but that's besides the point. So that means that from PHP 8.1, you now get 2 years of normal support plus 2 years of security support, and that will continue from now on. So I think that's a nice compromise for the people that really don't want to upgrade, but sort of really should. Of course, that means that Linux distributions, they can still, of course, support all the PHP versions for a lot longer than that if they want to. All right, that's what I had to talk about so far. I think I have 5 minutes for questions. Anything? I can't see you. There's one right there. A microphone is coming.
Hello, and
Hello.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. You were talking about the new deprecated attribute.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that the version was indicated. Where is it indicated in the code? Is it in the composer JSON file, or
You define that in the attribute.
in the But, sorry, excuse me.
Find it.
The version 2.4, but it references the PHP version.
It refers whatever you want it to be.
Yeah.
It is just free-form text.
Okay.
So it depends up to you what you do with this information.
Okay. Wow.
So you can use that for PHP would use it internally for PHP version number, I'm sure. For Symfony, for example, or any library, they will probably use the version of the library that I've used for that. But it isn't dedicated by PHP, the language. It is what you do with it. Yeah, you're welcome.
Hi. Thank you. Very interesting. I've got 2 questions. One is about asymmetric visibility.
Yes.
What about reflection? With reflection can we open properties, change them?
As far as I know, reflection hasn't changed how that works yet, although I saw some people arguing that that should change. But I don't think that has happened. So originally with reflection, you could already read the private properties, and that won't change. That hasn't been changed.
Okay.
So that will continue to work as far as I know.
And second question about property hooks. What about overriding those properties in extending classes? How do they inherit? Do I have to write my own set and get from scratch?
Okay, so the property hooks don't inherit. It is, but you can do, as far as, I actually haven't looked at this yet, but I think there's a way of doing a parent set and parent get, so you can call the ones from the parent like you do with normal methods. But I'm not 100% sure on that one. In general, the hooks only work when you write to the properties. They don't interfere with when you can write to it. So they also don't really interfere with inheritance whatsoever. But yeah, I think that in an inheritance class, if you don't redefine a property, it will just use them like you would expect. But if you do override them, then, well, clearly it's using the hooks that you then defined in the inheritance class. All right, there's one over there.
Hi, thanks for this presentation. With property hooks, I think a lot of getters and setters will be replaced by public properties. Yeah. What's the best way to declare interface on contracts with public properties without a getter?
That's a good question, but I don't quite know the answer. Come find me afterwards and we'll go find out together how that works, because I don't remember. I'm pretty sure there's a way of putting things in the interface, but I don't remember the syntax for it. There's a way of defining that it needs to implement get, for example, or set specifically. But in the interface itself, you don't get the hooks themselves. You only enforce that a property needs to be settable or gettable. Does that make sense? Sort of? If not, come find me afterwards. We'll go find out. All right, one over there.
Thank you. I also have a question about property hooks. Sorry.
The letters are falling off the stage.
In one of your slides, you set a setter property hook on the property with no getter. Yes. I think in C#, what happens then is you can set, but you can't get the property at all. Is it what happens here too?
No, you can still just get it.
Okay, so you get the original property without a function mapping. Okay, yeah. Thanks.
Hi.
Oh, it's right here.
Yeah, thank you. You said you are not using just-in-time compiler.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a bit more about why you are not using it?
Because my code is so simple, it doesn't really need it. Most of my sites that I write are like very simple, basic PHP code with a router and some static files. So I've never found a need for it. I'm pretty sure that if you use much big applications, when you use frameworks like Symfony, Laravel, Zen framework, all these things, then you'll see a lot of benefit. In my case, I was not going to see any difference, so that's why I'm not using it, because it made no sense for me to do. No, not a general thing to say don't use just-in-time compilation. It's just that for me it made no difference whatsoever. And it's the same thing with all the PHP.NET websites. They are so simple that it makes no difference whatsoever. Yep. Okay, time's up. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.